The knight rides forth at break of day, with sword of silver, heart of gold.
Right. Well, greetings of the time zone. I'm coming to you from not exactly sunny Ann Arbor in the Eastern time zone. Um, my presentation today is Historic Chivalry for Jedi Knights. Let me share my screen with you briefly. Okay, here is my outline. I believe in outlines because outlines are a social contract between me, the presenter, and you, the people being willing to give up your time to listen to me. So this is what I hope we manage to get done today in maybe a little over an hour. Number one, have a history-rooted sense of the development of Western European chivalry as a military and cultural identity from about the 10th through the mid-15th century. That's a long and complicated period in the history of Western Europe. I'm going to try to give it my best shot in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, but I have a narrative thread, so we should be able to get right to my point. Okay, that's number one. Number two, understand how the chivalric ideal lived on through Thomas Mallory's Mort d'Arthur and Tennyson Idylls of the King to be picked up by US movie culture in the 1950s, 1970s. Why is that important? Because this guy named George Lucas, born in the 40s, kind of growing up with movies, is going to make this movie, and the rest, as they say, is history. Okay. And then finally, and frankly, I think the most important part of this presentation, are Jedi Knights true knights? Is the Jedi Compass a true chivalric code? I know how I feel about it, but what I want to do is encourage you taking this now live, anybody out there watching the presentation taped, to be thinking about knighthood and chivalry and where it came from and where we are collectively now with this heritage. What this presentation is not, this is very important. It's not a lesson in medieval history. If you want lessons in medieval history, talk to me after the presentation, get a hold of me at some point, and I will be more than happy to barrage your inbox with bibliography after bibliography after wonderful links to online classes that are free that will teach you a whole lot more about medieval history than I had access to when I was learning it in the late 70s. Okay. This is not a discussion of military tactics. People have this idea when they think of what is a knight, what is chivalry, they see guys going at each other with swords and this formation over there and pikes and lances and barbicans and crossbows. Nope, not today. Again, if you want me to barrage your inbox with links and suggestions, trust me, I can do that. And then finally, the presentation is not absolute historical fact. Let me just forewarn you, this is something I would tell my undergraduates. I would ask them, point out history to me. Where does history live? Is history over there? History in a book? History, as we know, is what has survived to be interpreted. And that is literary survivals, which we're going to talk about today, artifactual survivals like armor and swords and physical culture, okay? The interpretations of those items, whether literary or even spiritual, actually, in terms of, say, liturgy, liturgical practices, because the knighting ceremony was a very spiritual ritual. Those are always being interpreted on the basis of new information turning up and other paradigms of deduction. What did this really mean? Did people really live this way? Why did this survive and not that survive? So again, I am presenting you really a story, hopefully a story that is supported by facts. And I'm going to leave it to you to maybe come up with your own deductions based on the evidence that I hope to present to you. So, very quickly, a little bit about me. What makes me think I'm qualified to give this presentation? Almost exactly 49 years ago, I saw this movie. It was called Star Wars. And in the movie, there was this quote. I had already decided I was going to go to Michigan State and major in medieval studies. So I heard this quote. I'm sitting there, and here's R2-D2, and here's Princess Leia, and here's Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Luke Skywalker, and greetings, General Kenobi. We're sort of in trouble here. Can you help us? Okay, so Obi-Wan Kenobi is explaining to Luke Skywalker that he, Obi-Wan, was once a Jedi Knight like his father, like Luke's father. And at that point, since I have a head full of medieval history, and I mean, in the late 70s, right? It's what books you can check out of the library. It's like, oh, knighthood. Okay, I get that. I know what knighthood is. And I go off to Michigan State in the fall of 1977, and I actually hobnob around with knights. They're knights from the Society for Creative Anachronism, and they are living their own research about what it is to be a knight. So 49 years from that, here I am addressing you who are in the Jedi community, you who maybe have aspirations to be a knight. So what is a knight? What is a Jedi Knight? Where do we get these notions of knighthood? Where do we get our notions of chivalry? I have a great definition for you, and that's the one I'm going to be using through this presentation. What is chivalry, right? So I got this from an article that I read. It was printed in 1992. It's in Comparative Civilizations. And the article is European Chivalry in the 1490s. Again, if you want the full bibliographic citation, I can give it to you. But I read this, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and I said, oh, this is the best definition of chivalry I think I've ever read. What is chivalry? A code of conduct originally developed for a tightly defined professional group, but later appealing to figures beyond the boundaries of the original chivalric world. Okay, that's where I'm going to start. So I appreciate that you've gotten this far with me. Let me ask real quickly. How many of you have heard of King Arthur? Raise your hand or put a thumb up. Okay, right? Okay. All right. So,
Heard of what? I
yep,
didn't
okay.
catch the word.
King Arthur.
Oh,
Have you heard of King Arthur? Yeah, all right. Most of us have, I think. So I'm not going to start with King Arthur. I just wanted to know if you had a sense of who he is. Okay, where we're going to start? We are going to start with, here's let's see here. Oops, wrong one. Here we go. All right. Back to share. So, Knights of History, limit 25 minutes. We're really already into it. The development of feudalism. So this discussion is really going to be in three parts. This is the beginning of part one. At the end of part one, I'm going to stop. I'm going to see if you have reactions or want to ask questions. I'm going to try to get through about 800 years of history in about 20 minutes. So I'm going to go a little quick. So we're going to approach this subject of chivalry, of what is knightly, uh, from an English standpoint, and that is deliberate because this field is so vast. You have to find an interpretive framework. Mine is England. So I don't want anybody to think that I think there is no chivalry or knightly civilization in Spain, in Portugal, that there are no knightly traditions in the Byzantine Empire. We're not going to talk about the Byzantine Empire. We're just going to go real fast. We're going to start pre-feudalism, pre-knight, pre-chivalry, with that moment in the early 5th century in England where the Romano-British administration gets a very sad memo from the Home Office in Rome. It says, we're in trouble here. You're going to have to look to your own defenses. This is like 410, around there, 450. Okay, so this is the one phrase that is going to prevail to explain feudalism, really from about 450 through about 1066. Again, I have to choose my interpretive framework or we're going to be here for a week. When Roman Britain is told to look to its own defenses because Rome is under pressure, it is quote unquote fallen. That's really the pattern for what is going to be feudal Europe generally. All these communities, they're linguistic groups, they're ethnic groups, they are going to look to their own defenses because the greater framework of Roman, the Roman Empire is gone. Okay. They've left some buildings, the Romans, they've left law codes, they've done a lot of important work, intellectual infrastructure through laws and so forth, but now that framework is gone. So Europe begins to develop its own feudal culture. Feudalism is where you have, again, not one definition for everybody, where you have what we would call warlords, maybe petty princes, despot kings, if you want, armed guys coming together and crystallizing lines of heredity and land regions. Again, this is a lot driven by blood ties, tribal ties, language groups. It's going to give us Charlemagne and what will wind up being the partitioning of the Holy Roman Empire. By the time we get to the Norman conquest, I know I'm going kind of fast here, 1066, we have communities that are in fact very sophisticated, okay? Maybe not by 21st century standards, but by where the Roman Empire was and how Western Europe has recovered, not just recovered defending itself and providing for itself, but also beginning to get some population back as well. Even with pressures from, say, Scandinavian invaders, we know them as the Vikings, or Islam, which is now a much bigger presence in the Mediterranean. Islam and Christendom is gonna have a conflict in the mid-8th century, essentially in Spain. By 1066 and the Norman conquest, you have the beginnings of hereditary nobility in a feudal sense where everybody reports to somebody. At the top of what's called the great chain of being is God. The church now, kings, because the church gives you your imperial status. Kings look for a blessing, etc. And then under the king, you get barons, tenants in chief, fiefs, etc., etc. You also get much more sophisticated and intentional weapons and tactics that preserve these structures. Again, 1066, really good example. Guys on horses, guys with horses, cross the English Channel. It's a dynastic problem. There's a battle, and England goes French. Okay. So with the Norman conquest, you also have Norman nobility, and you have the great structures of French government that have been developing since Charlemagne, since the Carolingian era. Okay. So as of the middle of that 11th century, you have a great deal of what's the word I want? You have responses all over Western Europe, including England in that, certainly France, where everybody's military organizations and modes are beginning to evolve according to everybody else's. Okay, so we've got a band of guys, you've got a band of guys, and what you need to continue to compete is you need efficient warriors, okay? So the best competitive warriors are those who are really well equipped, okay? And they're on horseback. And this is the era of the saddle. We are developing an era of the lance. That really isn't going to develop to full fruition until really the 13th century, 12th, 13th century. But right now, 1066 to 1095, knights are sort of coming into being as I said, very armed guys, very intentionally developed in courts. Not courts as we think about them in the 14th century, but courts where you have a king or a prince and a lot of armed guys around that figure who get their responsibilities as well as their powers from the king. So again, all the way down, great chain of being, right? So knights, because they are economic units, by that I mean they're really expensive. Okay, it's like having a battleship, right? And on horseback, hence we get chivalry from cheval. It's a French term. Where do we get knight? Okay, knight is actually an Anglo-Saxon and English term, and it comes from servant. So what we have now is we have the sense of being in service to a lord, coupled with that horse. You're giving military service on horseback in the name of your liege lord. Okay, that's really the beginning ground of chivalry. So knights are economic units. They're expensive to maintain. They got horses. They've got, at this point, mail armor. We don't have plate yet, but you need, wherever there are horses, you're going to need resources. Okay. Because knights have this necessary relationship to a liege lord, the church wants to get involved because all these very armed and professional now, they have one profession. The profession is to be a warrior on horseback. They tend to find ways of getting into fights with each other. Okay. Yeah, there are uses of knights, when you have a dynastic problem, given the Norman conquest, which was essentially a dynastic struggle between William the Bastard and who is really going to succeed Canute and Harold, etc. Similar things are going on in France. This, again, in the later Middle Age, or not the later Middle Ages, in the early into maturing Middle Ages, language groups are forming, ethnic groups, territorial boundaries. All of this is being defended and brokered through military prowess and the The essential military prowess is expressed through the knight, especially when you get a bunch together. This is how feudal service works, right? You're going to war at summer, and you there, and Duke and Count, you guys, all right, you guys are coming with me. We're going to go out there. We're going to, go take that section of land because, my great-grandfather promised it to me, and I'm going to go and get it. So the knights are sworn into this duty to their liege lord. Again, I'm going pretty quick here, keeping an eye on the time. And more knightly fealty becomes a matter that is overseen by the church. Church is very involved with managing how this violence plays out on people who don't have anything to do with it. Church is trying valiantly to make these guys serve a higher function. The Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church have parted in 1054. And then in 1095, the First Crusade is preached because, to a degree, this is how you manage the violence now in the early feudal era. You give the knights somewhere else to go with their energies where they can practice their profession of arms, not on your Christian population of Europe. Let me take a sip. The problem with the First Crusade is that it succeeds. Okay, this is 1095, 1096, really for the next 200 years or so. So the knights of Western Europe, the armies of Western Europe, and their English and their French and various other proto-national states join together in one big force, okay, and they get to Jerusalem by way of Constantinople. And if you're interested, you can read Anna Komnena's narrative of what that looked like from the balcony of Constantinople. She's looking out 1095, I think, 1096, looking out, seeing this army coming, and they're a rabble. This is the great Western army, okay, going on the First Crusade. They're just like, they're dressed bad. She says they eat terrible things. This is Byzantium, right? In the East, Rome doesn't fall. It's Byzantium, and they have a lot of ties farther east, so they're kind of living high in Constantinople. The Western armies, because they are proscribed from beating up on Christian populations, they have a tendency to take it out on populations in Eastern Europe that are not Christians. So their record with Eastern European Jews, not the best. And this is something, as we think about codes of chivalry, bear in mind that codes of chivalry are going to develop to keep knights on the straight and narrow toward other knights, essentially. That's number one. But also number two, non-combatants, okay? Women, the weak, the vulnerable, etc. That's the ideal. And that is coming out of, again, the Roman Church's desire to keep these guys just on mission, if you will. So go to Jerusalem. So at this point, again, you become a knight because you are growing up in a noble household. You've got the resources because essentially you're a landowner. You hold your land from the king. The king says, you owe me military service. Okay. Now that your profession is only arms and you're off to the Crusades, you come back, you still got to keep your skill set up. And knights sitting around are going to get into trouble. Okay, they're just, they got to exercise. Anybody who's been in the military knows you spend a lot of time exercising and drilling and training and repeat. Okay. So even though knights really have no purpose at this point, but as a weapon platform, and a mighty one too, with that mass of the horse coming at you, knights find a new expression. They find that they can practice their trade in arms in a form of armed play called the tournament. Tournaments are coming into fashion at the beginning of the 12th century. That's the 1100s. Certainly by the later 1100s, you've got tournaments. Tournaments are themselves going to change. If we think in terms of knights as a single guy on a horse with a lance, in the beginning, tournaments are melees, where you get a bunch of knights together and they hack at each other, and there can be some real bloodshed there. And again, the church steps in and says, now, wait a minute. Tournaments, not a good thing. So the tournament itself evolves as the knights are learning their martial skills. Tournaments evolve into single combat. Now we're getting into that moment that we have in the back of our heads when we think of jousting, right? So it's now more in terms of knight versus knight. Okay, again, I'm going real fast, making a lot of generalizations here. So you learn a little bit about tactics from a tournament, but best of all, you learn how to make money from a tournament. Because if you knock the other guy off his horse, other guy now owes you 50,000 marks. Okay. So in the culture of chivalry, you now have evolved into a moment where there is an honor associated with being ransomed. Okay, this is a gentleman's agreement among equals, knights versus knights, very important. Not knights versus foot soldiers. Okay, that's not going to happen. These are noblemen. They expect to interact militarily with noblemen. They don't want to get their hands dirty with those other guys. Okay, that's foot soldiers versus foot soldiers. A knight's true opponent is another knight. At the same time, to enforce this kind of unexpressed but developing sense of honor, and it is only honorable to interact in arms with a member of your class, you begin to get the literature of what it is to be knightly, what it is to be honorable, how you serve your lord. And this is actually becoming the Chivalric Code. So let me sum up. Until about the 12th century, 11th century, 12th century, knights are just another military asset, but they begin to have a sense of their own uniqueness in European culture. And it is going to be reflected and reinforced in the rituals involved with being knighted, swearing fealty, taking an oath. You have a vigil. The church puts its blessing on you, and then you confine yourself specifically to members of your own class. This is the beginning of the professionalism of chivalry, and it's going to be very meaningful for about 200 years, and then it's going to come to, unfortunately, a very bloody end. I want to take a second and go back to the Crusades. A couple of things did come out of the Crusades. I have never seen the movie The Kingdom of Heaven. I am not going to see the movie Kingdom of Heaven. The Crusades were they were a difficult time in the history of the world. From the Crusades, we get what are called the military orders. Military orders are not swearing fealty to a secular lord, okay? They're not knights in the sense of holding land from a lord and therefore owing military service to that lord. The military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, are associations of knightly men, relatively upper class because they've got the horses and gear, who are coming together themselves with a specific religious context of protecting the Holy Land, protecting pilgrims who want to go to the Holy Land. The Templars are going to be probably the most successful of the Templars and the Hospitallers because the Templars know how to make money and they are very wise with their money, and they wind up being objects of suspicion by the French king in 1320s or so. He's actually going to end the order by burning at the stake Jacques de Molay. You probably have heard that name. And the Templars are disbanded because, frankly, in my humble opinion, from everything that I have read, not because they have the Holy Grail, but because they succeeded magnificently as really the first extra-governmental international organization. They always have that taint that maybe in the Holy Land they spent a little bit too much time with the Saracens and they've learned stuff from the Saracens that maybe they weren't supposed to know, like medicine and astronomy and geometry and mathematics, stuff that, we don't want to talk about that stuff. The Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John, are going to go on for a while, but it is interesting that these non-governmental guys are really good about coming up with tactics and really drilling themselves to be even more professional as a fighting group than the sort of, whoever you can get in the royal families of Europe. So, okay. So at this point, we have the development of manuals of chivalry. I'm just going to hold this up here. I'm not going to share my screen. This is Ramon Ull. This is the Book of the Order of Chivalry. That's down here in my screen share, if you want to take a look at that. It's kind of dry reading. You can read that little paragraph there. So this is the new translation from 2013. So he's writing between 1274 and 1276, and he's got sort of a dialogue with a knight. Knight's telling somebody who wants to know about what it is to be knightly. Okay, well, sit down and let me tell you. So it begins on the beginning of chivalry, all right? There once was no charity, loyalty, justice, or truth in the world. Enmity, disloyalty, injustice, and falsehood came into being. And because of this, there was error and confusion amongst the people of God, who were created so that God be loved, known, honored, served, and feared by man. Okay, so Ramon Ull is putting the beginning of chivalry right back to the primordial soup of the world and saying, okay, it was a mess, but now we're here in the modern day, and the man who wishes to join the order of chivalry must ponder and reflect upon the noble beginning of chivalry, and the nobility of his courage and his good breeding must be of one accord and in concert with the beginning of chivalry. And if he does not do this, he will be contrary to the order of chivalry and to its beginnings. That is, according to Ramon Ull, chivalry has come into the world to bring order to the world, okay? Let me stop here and ask if anybody here among us Jedis, does this sound familiar to us? It should. What is a Jedi's role? We bring civilization by bringing peace. Well, you heard it here first then. in the 13th century. Ramon Ol. He's got us beat by, 1,000 years. So Ol is picked up and read, and his ideas give the knightly class an origin story. Now, it doesn't go everywhere. This is not, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Discord. It's, New York Times review of books. But it does get promulgated through telling around the campfire, if you will, where also is getting promulgated at the same time. Chrétien de Troyes, you may not be familiar with this guy. Chrétien de Troyes picks up a group of local legends from Great Britain about Lancelot and Guinevere and Percival and a Holy Grail. And Chrétien de Troyes is popularizing in French the Arthurian legends as, again, a way of telling his noble sponsors that their background is noble and wonderful and truth and justice, and this is the right order of things and what they're fighting for. So this is how we are getting chivalric codes. Chivalric codes are being minted, if you will, as sort of chivalric, knightly popular culture. They're not just entertainments. Fighting guys want to hear about fighting guys. Okay, there you go. Thank you. That'll be sixpence, please. But it's also underlining what the church wants the nobility to do, which is to set aside its pettiness. And if it really has to pick on people, then keep it to yourselves. There's going to be some amount of warfare. Well, that's just life on planet Earth, but keep it regulated. Okay, knight versus knight. And here's your code and truth and justice, and we're trying to civilize the world here. Okay, so that's pretty much how chivalry begins and how it matures. And then a little bit farther down on my page here, the 100 Years' War changes everything, and it does, and it changes it horrifically. France and England get into dynastic tensions over, are we French, are we English, what are we? About, the third decade into the 14th century. And at that point, you still have the knight on the field and these cavalry charges and cavalry charge and crunch, and then the foot soldiers come in, etc. But there is a new piece on the board. And that new piece on the board is going to drive not just an evolution in armor, but it's also going to ultimately end what this first period of chivalry is all about. And what I mean, you can see it down there, longbows and crossbows. Up to this point, 1348 or so, 1328, 1348 is the Great Plague, which is a whole different matter. When the English start bringing longbowmen to the 100 Years' War battles, Crécy and Poitiers, they are bringing an escalation that is going to drive the next 100 years, 150 years worth of military tactics. Because we have until this moment, knight versus knight. And now England is going to destabilize this with the longbow. Longbow is not a direct fire thing, it's not like a duel where, it's longbow versus longbow, that target over there. The longbow is a ranged weapon. So instead of, me to you, I'm looking at the gallery view here. With the longbow, and you can go on YouTube and see this if you've watched that presentation on Agincourt, and it's gritty and bloody and terrible. You see the English tactics as they're starting to develop in these first big battles of the 100 Years' War, and that is up, you arc it, 500 arrows at a time. They go up in a big arc, in a big group, and then they come down. We all know per second. bodkin points, which are 2 and 3 inches long. And as they come down in descent, they go through everything, everything. Mail can't deal with this, so plate armor is now evolving. But even plate armor has its limitations when it's faced ultimately as at Agincourt, when there's just such a mass of this ranged uh, flock of angry steel bees coming at you, there's really not much you can do. You can armor yourself up, you can armor your horse up. The point is made in that presentation on Agincourt. But if you look up, you're going to get it through the ice slots. So archery pretty much is going to end chivalry. Just a moment. I am delighted to tell everyone we are getting a downpour here in Ann Arbor, and I am really happy. Yeah, that's okay. So number 2 here, who's writing a book of chivalry? Geoffroy de Charny, the Book of Chivalry. He's really the last great eyewitness account of a big 100 years war battle. He's actually going to die tragically while holding the Oriflamme, Poitiers, September 19th, 1356. The Oriflamme is the great banner of France. When you see it, it means that no quarter will be given. So no prisoners are going to be taken. This is a fight to the death of, 5,000 guys, which tells you that at this point, where knights had been making money through the tournament circuit, they're making money. They were making money ransoming knights. They would occasionally take prisoners in battles like this and also ransom. Okay, we're taking you back to the Tower of London until your family pays us 50,000 marks. Not the English longbowmen. They're not taking prisoners. And in this fight, the French aren't taking prisoners either. So what about that chivalric code? That is not an issue here. Maybe a couple of prisoners, okay. But ultimately, now getting to Agincourt, we're not taking prisoners anymore. We're not ransoming anybody anymore. The case of Agincourt, and why I wanted you to see that video, it's extremely expressive of now it's just killing. And when you've got a dismounted knight on the ground and he's got an ice slot and you're not taking prisoners, you have a little dagger called a misericord and it goes right through the ice slot, or you simply cut their throats. It's hard for me to watch that presentation on Agincourt because in order to do history, you've got to have a certain amount of boundary here, right? But it's just so amazingly brutal. Here are guys at the top of their military game, and they're noble and truth and justice and standing for peace and civilization, and all that's gone as of Agincourt. And then what comes after that? Even worse, it's clear that the lesser sorts now have a military advantage over the betters at archery. Archery, or Agincourt, is the beginning of the end. France creates a standing army. France has had it. France really does win the 100 Years' War, but France is done. France says, nope, we're not going to leave this to knights anymore. We want a standing army. They create what's called the ordonnances. They lay out professional leadership. They lay out ideas for how military organization on the field is going to be conducted. This is not knightly anymore. This is professionalism. Where's the nobility? Where's the honor? Where's the ransoming? It's all gone at the end of the 100 Years' War. It's been superseded by the necessity for military culture to evolve. And then the final drop in the bucket here, the final bullet, right, is the bullet, the gunpowder transition. Now, there are a certain number of handguns through the later decades of the 15th century, but really as of 1490, when the Venetian Republic says, no, we're done with strings, we're done with arrows and bolts and so forth. We're just going to go to guns. Again, what happens in this situation? Military evolution. Everything is always evolving given what the threat is. We've gone from archery. Archery is now obsolete. We've gone to guns. Now, guns don't have the rate of fire that bowmen have, right? But with field artillery, it kind of doesn't matter because artillery can just knock down castles. In the old days, the lord and his castle, you're prepared for a siege. Maybe somebody throws rocks at it. You've got crossbowmen up there. Bing! All right. This is different. This is artillery that is simply going to make castles, to a degree, also obsolete. So now, the way historical periods happen, this doesn't just all suddenly happen, Wednesday at 3 p.m. in May of 1426, right? We stopped being chivalry and we started being musketeers. The important part of this, even though chivalry is a military tactic, has kind of ceased to be. It'll go along for a while. There will still be jousts well into Henry VIII's period. There will still be knightly conduct on battlefields. You see some knights, in the wars of religion on the continent. But really, as a military force, chivalry is on its way out at the turn of the 16th century. So, I know that was a lot, but that sort of gives you a foot in the door to stand on, thinking about where this whole business of knighthood and chivalry comes from. You can say, wait a minute, I watched the Terry Jones video, and I watched the Agincourt presentation. So you're saying that the Chivalric Code maybe wasn't always an observed thing. No, it probably wasn't, but it was an ideal. It was a standard. It was something that you could judge your conduct to. You want to be honorable, then here's where you're parallel with those goals. Here's where maybe you're off those goals. It's a compass, right? I'm using that word very deliberately. It's a compass. The Chivalric Code is a compass. Okay. That is the end of part one. Let me de-share my screen and see if there are any survivors this far.
There are no questions in the chat so far, but
all right.
I would like to ask you if you would put your contact information in the chat.
Oh, yep, I can.
And also, you mentioned a person watching the battle in Byzantium from a balcony. Is that in your notes?
No, that's Anna Komnena. She is a Byzantine princess. You would be surprised to know that she's got her own sort of propaganda thing going there. She sees the Western armies coming and she's like, oh my God, who are these people? Why don't they bathe? I can put that in the chat at some point, or let me take this opportunity to just go ahead and put my institutional email in there. All right, there we go. There is a question. Yes, thank you. Mace Windu, we're keepers of the peace, right? Okay. Drew the Poet, you're up.
Okay, so still haven't got my Padawan name. I'm still kind of new.
That's okay.
The thing that I found interesting that you mentioned about the what was it? The Knights Templar, that they were the first, what was it? Military. They didn't exactly serve a secular, secular king or anything else like that. So it's like, even while they were, fighting the Crusades, they weren't really serving under any kings or lords. They were just serving under themselves, which makes sense because they went from each part of Europe and they were like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, they were I don't know what the term was back then, but they were essentially like, poor knights. And there was a lot of, conspiracy theory and controversy behind them. Like, what was it? The Knights Templar were this secret order that have gone from Crusades now to the, oh, Jesus, did I forget the name of this other group? Sorry, I just woke up, so my brain's a little bit fried,
No,
but
that's okay. No, no,
they
no.
pretty much transcended the Freemasons.
Right.
So, but anyways, I just found it interesting that they were the first military group that didn't really serve under a king or a secular feudal system. They just served under themselves.
Right. Well, so thank you for pointing that out. And that is going to wind up being, to a degree, one of the major reasons for why the Templars wound up suppressed. The last I knew from the scholarship, they sort of wound up caught in a conspiracy because they held so much land themselves. They're not feudal lords, right? So if you think of the great chain of being, God, the church, the king, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, everybody else, the Templars don't take their orders from a king. They kind of don't exactly take their orders from the church. So they're just out there, a military organization with a lot of territory. Why do you want to give your territory to the Templars? Why do you want to give the Templars lots of money? Because they're holy people. So if you give lots of stuff to and this is very common in medieval times. If you want to ensure the salvation of your soul, you make sure that you give a certain amount of your mortal possessions and monies to deserving institutions like monasteries. This is big time for monasteries. So the Templars are sort of like a mounted monastery, if you will. They get churches. The Temple Church in London is the Temple. It's now a law center for many, many years, downtown London. These are sacred precincts, not answering to a secular lord. Uh-oh. Okay, so if you attack the Templars cross you, what are you going to do? They're armed, they've got territory, they've got money. So Philip le Bel of France figures out a way of framing them essentially for all sorts of terrible things. And he has them essentially investigated as heretics, and then whoosh, that's it.
Yeah, because I know because I know they were executed at one point. I forget the
Yep.
exact year and timestamp, but they were all burned at the stake or whatever. But it just makes me wonder how the Templars were able to get away for so long, pretending that they were serving the kings when they really weren't. They were serving under themselves. Makes me wonder how they were able to get away with it for so long. And supposedly they were the first group of knights or military group or whatever that invented the credit system, the financial credit system that would eventually, over time change to the credit system that we know of today. So it's like they were saying that they didn't want worldly possessions, and yet they were hoarding worldly possessions. So
well, it just comes to us, and we can't turn it away, But yeah, right. So, okay, let me go ahead then and get to my part two. The Templars are a very interesting group in many, many ways. In my opinion, they're kind of ahead of their time in terms of being able to bring together people from disparate areas with a particular mission. Some of you may say, gosh, that sounds like International Jedi Federation, where we have people all over the globe coming together for a particular discipline, a particular code. What are we doing here, etc. I don't want to push that analogy too far. Okay, let me go back to sharing. So where we were, at the end of the chivalric era, a man named Thomas Malory, Englishman, writing in 1469 or so, makes an English narrative out of some of these troubadour tales from the French, Chrétien de Troyes, And he calls it Mort d'Arthur. Mort d'Arthur is ironically named. I gotta find my. Now, darn it. I knew it. I knew I was gonna want to read from something that I put so far away I wasn't gonna be able to find it. Here we go. I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't want to spend too much time because I still got to get us into the 20th century here. When Mallory writes Mort d'Arthur, he's writing the death of Arthur at the time when chivalry is going out of fashion. Okay, he doesn't realize it yet that it's going out of fashion. It's not going to get published until 1485. Printed by Caxton, who's also going to give us a version of the English Bible. So the original Arthurian tales are French. They're troubadour tales. They're coming out of even more ancient traditions. Mallory is looking toward the history of the kings of Britain. He's got this fabulous guy from history, Arthur, King of the Britons, who, as far as anyone knows today, didn't exactly exist, sort of a pastiche of Celtic and Saxon warrior heroes, again, coming out of that sort of Romano-British moment where Britain and other little places in Europe had to look to its own defenses after the fall of the Roman Empire. So when Caxton gets this, we don't believe that there are a lot of manuscripts that Mallory wrote originally, 1469. Caxton gets it. He publishes a very interesting foreword to it. I'm going to read what he wrote. He talks about how he wanted to, this is Caxton writing, introducing Mort d'Arthur. He talks about, according to his copy of what Mallory has written, this is the publisher of Mallory, have set down in print to the intent that noble men may see and learn the noble acts of chivalry. This is 1485, chivalry's on the way out. The gentle and virtuous deeds that some knights used in those days, by which they came to honor, and how they that were vicious were punished and oft put to shame and rebuked. Humbly beseeching all noble lords and ladies, very important phrase here, with all other estates, of what estate or degree they been of, that shall see and read in this said book and work, that they take the good and honest acts in their remembrance, and to follow the same. So what Caxton is saying, introducing Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, is everybody who reads this can be chivalric, can practice these noble virtues. Now, you can say, whoa, wait a minute, hold it. What does King Arthur know about noble virtues? Well, there is that, right? These are projections onto the past of chivalric virtues that, frankly, are being superseded even as Caxton is preparing this for publication, okay? Caxton goes on to say, for herein may be seen noble chivalry, courtesy, humanity, friendliness, hardiness, love, friendship, cowardice, murder, hate, virtue, and sin. Do after the good and leave the evil, and it will bring you good fame and renommee, French word for renown. 1485. What is happening in 1485? The first Tudor king, Henry VII. I'm here to tell you that Henry VII doesn't like making war nearly as much as he likes making money, okay? So 300 years pass, really, from Mallory, And Arthur, this is where Arthur is now entering English literature. Before that happens, though, another book is published. I call this the most important book of the Reformation you've never heard of. This is the Enchiridion of Erasmus. It is the Enchiridion of the Christian Knight. Erasmus is writing in 1501. This is a handbook of chivalry for people who will never have anything to do with warfare, okay? In this life, one must be on guard. In the first place, you should continually bear in mind that mortal life is nothing but a kind of perpetual warfare. And on it goes. I put this link in the Facebook page of IJF. I think you should read the first chapter of it. This is the first Jedi handbook. This is going to tell you how to live your life according to a higher standard. What Erasmus is going to say in 1501, Erasmus is going to say to you, you've already got a liege lord. It's God. You've already sworn an oath. It was your baptismal oath, okay? So all you need to do now is go out there. You've got the Chivalric Code. I'm making it simple for you who've never picked up a knife, never picked up a sword, aren't going to pick up a crossbow. You're going to be a knight, okay? Erasmus's work, far more popular in its day than Malory's Morte d'Arthur. Morte d'Arthur is going to disappear. Erasmus is going to go on to fight out the Reformation with Luther. Arthur disappears quite literally for 300 years. Part of that is because when the Tudors come to power, the Tudors have a great chivalric figure already. Her name is Elizabeth I. They don't have to go into the past to look for important people. They've got one right in front of them in the person of good Queen Bess. Furthermore, the Puritans in England take a look at some of the subject matter of the Arthurian tales and they say, let's see here, incest, adultery, that does not sound like things we really want to put our stamp on. So Morte d'Arthur surfaces again in the Victorian age. I'm not kidding you. It literally lies dormant for about 300 years until Thomas Carlyle in 1840 is giving a lecture on why we need great men in this terrible, dark, sad, industrial, coal, smoke-stained Victorian age. It's right there. Great men taken up in any way are profitable company. That's what Caxton just said, right? Noble virtues. This is what Ramon Ols said. Noble virtues. This is the knightly code. This is chivalry. The light which enlightens, which is enlighten the darkness of the world. So who's going to pick this up? Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of England. And he is going to write the Idylls of the King. The Idylls of the King are going to is going to explode the imagination of Victorians. And the Gothic revival is underway by the 1880s, and suddenly everything is Arthur again, which is a neat trick for somebody who never really existed and is an amalgam of chivalric traits. So, and you can go out and read about Tennyson, read about Malory. I'm not going to talk about it right now today because this is where I really want us to be, okay? So we are now, we've now understood how we get the chivalric idea into the 19th century, into the 20th century. It's through Arthur. Arthur comes to us through Alfred Lord Tennyson, who is looking back at Malory, who is looking back to this ideal knightly figure who didn't really exist at the end of the chivalric age in 1485. Well, this is how it should have been, and it isn't anymore. Erasmus says, but it can be. You can be a knight. I can be a knight. It's all on us. It's right there. So what did George Lucas have in mind? And this is where I'm going to take us back. Got a bunch of questions here. Because this is the moment where, frankly, I am most interested in having us arrive. I want to go back to that moment in A New Hope, where Ben Kenobi says, I was once a Jedi Knight like your father. I'm going to stop sharing at this point because, as I said, this is where I'd much rather be. So I have in my hand right here, I have the Jedi Compass. I frightened people yesterday by saying, I'm not just going to do 3 parts of it. I'm going to take on the whole thing. Because it's my argument to you at this point, and I hope I've made my argument, although I feel like I've, got a whiplash from going through about 2,000 years of history in about an hour and a half. Okay, so here we are as Jedi. And let me get one more document here. Yeah, come back here. I will share with you. So these are the movies that were around at the time of George Lucas's childhood, okay? Ivanhoe, Knights of the Round Table, Prince Valiant, King Richard and the Crusaders, Black Shield of Falworth, The Court Jester, which is Danny Kaye and sort of a parody, but it tells you a little bit about knightly values. The Once and Future King is published in 1958. El Cid, Spanish Knights. I said, this is going to have an English interpretive framework, but it doesn't mean that there aren't knights somewhere else. Sword in the Stone, that's where I get involved as a kid. I'm 3 years old, 4 years old. Beckett, The Warlord, again, Charlton Heston. Lord of the Rings comes out, 2nd edition, 1964. Camelot, if you're into, musicals. The Lion in Winter, Elizabeth R. Great series. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Yeah, you seek the Grail. Let me tell you, the Puritans really didn't like that Catholic stuff, in the 16th century in England. Holy Grail? No, we're not going to do that. Robin and Marion, very lifelike sword fight at the end of that. Very Robert Shaw versus Sean Connery, I think it is. They cut each other to ribbons over the course of an afternoon. Star Wars: A New Hope. And then finally, just over the horizon from A New Hope is the movie Excalibur. Okay. So, who's still alive? And my question to you. All right. I'm going to argue, based on everything that I just laid out there, are Jedi Knights real knights? Let me see if I can find my one last document here with all my questions, all my discussion questions. Here it is. Okay. Yeah. All right. Last screen sharing. And then we're going to the pub. Yeah. All right. So now is that moment where I want you all to get a piece of paper out, or fortunately, this is being recorded so you can come back and look at it. What we inherit and what we can embrace as Jedi Knights. The persistence of ideal chivalric virtues equals this thing, the Jedi Compass. I hope I have proven in one way or the other that, oh my goodness, we have a living expression of the Chivalric Code right here that we participate in. I know I sort of got into a discussion earlier in the week on Discord with someone where I sort of quoted him the chapter and verse of what IJF was all about. IJF is about the compass. IJF is the Templars, if you want. IJF is that we're not going to affiliate with anybody because we're here doing a job of bettering community through bettering ourselves. So, what is a knight then? Someone who has gone through their training, meditation, feeling, using the force, patience, the code, mindset of service. Not so much a medieval knight with a true feudal responsibility to a lord, right? mindset of service for a medieval knight is always to the guy who is providing your fodder for your horse. How to keep a cool head in a stressful situation. This does not mean, hey, you insulted my mom, I'm going to put a lance through your eye. Nope. One who has the ability to use the Force to affect positive change. They can, through the Force, sense its currents. Not a lot of that in medieval history. But down here, okay, so this is actually a document on the IJF archive, in the IJF archives. There you go, Jedi Praxium, Knighthood and Beyond. So my argument to you, look at all those explanation points, I really mean this. Star Wars Jedi Knights are real historic knights in one sense, martial prowess with the lightsaber. Okay, there's that presence of the original profession of arms. Are they some aspect of hereditary noble? No. Well, maybe. Are they economic units? Jedi Knights are not economic units. Nobody expects Obi-Wan Kenobi to go out there and reduce a castle and bring all the booty back. Okay, nope, that's not going to happen. Do they compete for glory or ransoms? No. Do they champion might makes right for the Republic? No. Do they make sure that they are above the lesser sorts? What is the nobility of the Jedi? Well, the nobility of the Jedi is the nobility of midi-chlorians, right? It's what's in your blood that gives you that connection to the Force. In that sense, yeah, you could say there's an aristocracy there, but not conventionally like a medieval knight. So my discussion to you, how are we knightly? I think I know. I go back to that moment in A New Hope where Obi-Wan Kenobi says, I was once a Jedi Knight. What's this was? Dude, did somebody say, okay, you're on furlough, you don't have to worry about this anymore? I don't know. I think Obi-Wan Kenobi is a knight right to the end and beyond. So let me just stop it there. I realize this has been sort of a barrage of concepts. I'm looking at, we can't use the Force via telekinesis as much as we want. Philosophies and codes definitely align to the idea that, yep, okay. So this is my argument. This is the compass. The compass is absolutely a chivalric code. It is as much a chivalric code as Mallory tells you should be following through that introduction from Caxton. Thomas Carlyle says follow the image and deeds of great men, heroes. We are ourselves bringing the compass, bringing what is knightly, chivalric, into being every single day, that we are engaging with the compass that tells us loyalty to the code, duty to the all, respect the law, defense, action. None of this would sound particularly weird to Ramon Ol or Geoffroy de Charny and so forth. So, prove me wrong. Is this a chivalric code or not? Let me just say chivalric code, it's okay. Aligns with the Jedi code. Thank you, Drew the Poet. Let me get back. Sword and Stone, yeah. Okay. Lucas drew inspiration. Yes, he did. Absolutely. Let me just say quickly, there was no Japanese content here. I realize that. That's because we grew up, really for most of us, in Western civics classes with the Song of Roland and not the Tale of Genji. The samurai tradition, a little bit different from what we inherit through King Arthur and Mallory and so forth, through our English language, and how we project back onto the past our ideals that have distilled down to us through this interpretive framework. So I say again, talk me out of it. Is there any reason to, maybe I should ask this, is there any reason to believe that the compass is not a chivalric code? Hop in there. What do you think? Are we knightly?
I believe that we are, especially if we look at things from a moral code requiring honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak. I do believe that we are in that sense. And everyone has their, I guess, again, for the Force, their higher power that they are saying, you know what, I'm going to hold up and hold these codes too. And then that also comes down to accountability, because then the knights hold each other accountable to that code. And we look to each other to, hey, this is the standard, this is that line. You are maintaining or going above and holding that standard, or you are not. So I say yes, me personally.
I absolutely accept that. I think so I was thinking about, I woke up this morning thinking about when Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Luke, I was a Jedi Knight like your father. I say to myself, you know, when I saw this when I was 17, it's like, oh yeah, knight. But now, 50 years worth of research later, I think, what context does Luke have? What historical context does Luke have to understand what it is to be a knight? Does he know this Anglo-Saxon word? Has he ever seen a horse? What is a knight to Luke Skywalker? And then I realized, and this is still sort of like, you know, putting the hair up on my scalp. Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't talking to Luke Skywalker. By Jiminy, he's talking to us because we have that background to understand what a knight is through everything I just threw out there to you, the whole development of what it is to be a knight, to be chivalric, chivalry, even now, you know, people holding doors for each other. In the old days, it's very gendered. Now we know anybody can be knightly. This is exactly what Erasmus is saying in the Enchiridion. Dude, you don't need a sword. You don't need a shield. You don't need a charger. It's you. It's your combat, your interior combat. The Islamic warriors that the Templars may have exchanged, you know, notes with after class. Islam has its own tradition of I believe it's called jihadanim. That is the war with the holy war with oneself, where we continue to be present to getting better today than we were yesterday. Okay. And then we take that out into the world and we model it. This is absolutely, I'm pounding the compass here. So I'm saying to you, everybody out there listening to this, I want to be careful with this because there are masters and knights here. You are ennobled. You are ennobled by following the compass. That moment in Henry V, where he says, and you who shed your blood with me today, he's talking to the scum of the earth, the English longbowmen. Here's Kevin Branagh, right? You who shed your blood with me today will be ennobled because together, we are all chivalry. Okay. Nope. Drew the poet, right? Yes. Keeping an open mind. Absolutely. This is part of the alignment with the compass. What does the compass say? Now, this is something that the knights don't have. They don't have a mandate to go out there and learn. Okay. They don't go to the library. They don't want to, they don't need to spend their time really getting an education, right? They're happy where they are learning the profession of arms. We Jedi are out there educating ourselves. Ignorance, yet knowledge, okay? That's on our plate to do. That's our path of knighthood. But right now, following the compass, we are ennobled. We are ennobled as inheritors of the chivalric continuity coming down from when knights back in the 11th century said maybe not to each other, but maybe they got to thinking about it. We need to have a guide toward a standardization of how we want to be in the world. And I think that's the compass. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, why I like IJF, probably of all the orders and temples right now of Jedi realism. Let me just go through. Knights Templar would be considered Jedi or Sith. Okay. The the Templars certainly come into being with good intentions. They want to make sure that the pilgrims get to Jerusalem and back intact. Okay. They develop their tactics pretty much to that end, and they're sort of victims of their success. This is my personal read on things, I think, as we understand the Sith now, and every once in a while, I think somebody should remake Star Wars according to what we know of the Star Wars universe today, so we could go back and correct all that stuff in the original movie that we now know to be wrong. That's a joke. I think where Sith are right now, the Templars would not necessarily align with Sith. I think they would, in fact, put them far more toward Jedi than Sith. Okay, Master Seta. Yeah.
So one of the things that you brought up that I really wanted to just appreciate is when you brought up Erasmus and how he pointed out, I believe you said it was Erasmus who pointed out that we swear to a higher power instead of to a king, a monarch. And when you look at the compass, you have that the force, it's not necessarily that you're swearing to the force, but you see, you either believe it's sentient, you believe it's non-sentient, but somehow that inner working ties you to the community that you're a part of, however you perceive the force. And that's effectively what we're saying, is that we're tying our oaths to that connection that we perceive as the force, whether it's to community or to a higher power, a god of some sort, to push that down. And I just really wanted to appreciate that you brought that book up.
A couple of years ago, I read a book called Fatal Discord. It is the story of Erasmus and Martin Luther. Martin Luther, of course, gets the credit for the Reformation, but I'm here to tell you, from what I have read and researched subsequently to being back in grad school and etc., a long, long time ago, I now believe that really Erasmus is bringing the Reformation. And I say that because Erasmus is going back to the original Greek. He is doing a better translation of the Greek New Testament that Luther is going to use. Okay. Erasmus is Catholic. He is a member of what's called the Brethren of the Common Life. This is in the Netherlands. It is a lay spiritual community where they're just, it's, if you will, it's sort of like the Templars, right? People getting together with a common purpose, sort of a study group. And Erasmus, very erudite, very scholarly, is doing these translations. And then he comes to write the Enchiridion. Then 20 years later, of course, Luther is kicking up dust in Germany. And our focus, our Western Civ focus goes, whoop, all right, now we're going to go over here and talk about the 95 Theses. Well, wait a minute, hold it. What about Catholicism? Catholicism is going to go through its own Reformation, if you will. Erasmus really just wants to see the Catholic Church renewed. He doesn't want to see it torn down. And to a degree, the Enchiridion is kind of the opening salvo in, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's keep what's good and refine the rest and not just, run around crazy. All right, let me read this. Vincent writes, for me, the issue is the romantic concept we have of what a knight is, but it's difficult to compare what it really was. Yep. So we can make our own concept. Why not? It is all about our way of life and our ethics, and those should show in our daily act. Otherwise, the knights were not all that we think they were. Yes. So history is made daily, depending on how we interpret it, depending on what has survived. Now we know, like, this documentary on Agincourt, it's not, oh, once more into the breach, dear friends. That was Shakespeare. Wow, what a noble battle. Now we go back and look at the reconstructions with what we know. And it's like, ooh, that's, ugh. So exactly right. So we ourselves are living and interpreting what it was to be knightly, what it was to be chivalric, if you will. Yep, exactly. That's why archaeologists are important. We ourselves are interpreting this and expressing it through our behavior into the world. You can do that with the Enchiridion. I like the compass. When you anchor your actions to something like the compass, when you use it as a compass, right? Compass gives you a direction. When you anchor your actions to a compass, you are ennobling according to the implications and intentions of that document, which is why I love the Enchiridion. So there's 11:30. So I would like to wrap up so everybody can have a bite to eat and maybe refresh their tea before they go to the Apprentice meeting at 1. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I am humbled by you all who have attended. Oh, wait a minute. Manny says, yeah, massively knight's a bunch of ordinary people shit. Does naming someone a knight make them a better fighter? To which Orlando Bloom answers, yes. Ah, all right. He's bringing the Henry V, right? Henry V, okay? The Band of Brothers. I don't know. You may have talked me into it. I watched the Agincourt documentary and I go, why didn't I take up something clean like nursing instead of history? You know, I mean, nursing, yes, it is because the sensual. Okay, this is an important thing. Let me respond to this. This is why we are knighted in the IJF by other knights. Okay, we're not knighted by a liege lord. We're knighted by other people who have been through the trials, who have done the education, who have been out there and been part of service. They're the ones who are turning around and saying, I acknowledge that your activities are making the world a better place. It's empowering. Wizard of Oz, right? What does the Scarecrow need? What does the Cowardly Lion need? What does the Tin Man need? Recognizing that you have a part and that it's meaningful and that you have put the sacrifices in is ennobling. And when you have a context like the compass, you are ennobled. You are knightly. We are all knights. We just maybe haven't gotten to that formal ceremony where somebody says, yep, you're a knight. But we are knights right now. If we're not knights right now, how are we ever going to be? Okay, that's enough. You've heard me prattle for almost an hour, almost 2 hours. Enough. If you would like to contact me again, lizcal@umich.edu, although I worry that this is going to go up on YouTube and then I'll get 250 million spams, but oh well. That's my nightly trial. Okay. Thank you all. And I appreciate that you've been willing to sit through a very, very long and streamlined discussion of a very complicated situation. Wait, just like the sheriff anoints some guy as lawman. Yes, that's right. You're deputized. Oh yeah, yes, exactly. Or you lose yourself in the role. Bye, Drew. You lose yourself in the role and then you forget who gave you that power in the first place. That's right, exactly. Okay, I'll stick around here. I wish you all again a good rest of the day. Go to that apprenticeship meeting. Oh boy, I'm getting tongue-tied. Enough. I'll stick around and talk to Sophia about housekeeping of wrapping up. And again, feel free to reach out either my email or on Discord and say, wait a minute, I've been thinking about this. You're full of what havoc. Okay, that's history. That's scholarship. All right. Thank you. right.
of gold
Well, greetings of the
winding
time
woods
zone. I'm coming
and
to you
mountains
from not
bold,
exactly
a
sunny Ann Arbor
hero's
in
tale
the Eastern
to
time zone.
be retold.
My presentation today is Historic Chivalry for Jedi Knights.